I'm so glad you're with me today. Our topic, creating a pollinator garden. So whether you have acres and acres of space for planting, or you live in an apartment or a condominium, or you just have a small lot, I hope that today I can give you some ideas for how you might create a pollinator-friendly space. Now, besides aesthetic value, the benefit of a pollinator garden is to help support our declining population of pollinators. You know, there are a lot more of us. We need roads, we need driveways, we need impervious surfaces just so we can get around. As a result, our pollinators are suffering from a loss of habitat to support their needs. Our native pollinators are a vital part of our environment and essential for the reproduction of native plants and crops. Providing nectar, pollen, and shelter for the pollinators will benefit our entire ecosystem. Habitat enhancement for pollinators can also support other beneficial insects. You know, those insects that perhaps will parasitize or predate upon harmful pests that may be damaging your plants. A pollinator garden also provides resources for an assortment of wildlife. Many times I've been asked the question, do these pollinator gardens really make any difference? Well, the Garden Ecology Lab research at Oregon State University tells us that gardens that provide native plants and a diversity of flower species results in a greater abundance of pollinating insects, just what we want. So science tells the tale, it does make a difference. Not only that, it adds so much beauty to the landscape. Here's what I hope you come away with after this presentation today: that you will know the keys to creating a successful pollinator garden, that you will learn the basic steps required in the planning and preparing of a planting site, and you will understand the importance of monitoring and maintaining your pollinator garden. These are the keys to the creation of a successful pollinator garden. There's kind of a lot of keys. So let's look at each one of them a little more closely. You know, pollinators are in heavy competition for nectar and pollen resources, and flowers have adapted their shapes to meet the specific behaviors and body characteristics of a restricted group of pollinators. For example, different bee species are attracted to flowers with a specific shape. A bee with a long tongue and a large body can be found visiting a complex flower, vetches, clovers. But the short-tongued bees prefer easily accessible composite flowers, several flowers, single flowers, on a multiple bush, such as the sunflower, or as pictured here, Douglas aster, penstemon, which is more of a tubular-shaped flower, Rudbeckia, and Russian sage. In general, bees are attracted to white, yellow, purple, or blue flowers that are open, shallow, or in some cases tubular. Examples being yarrow, lupin, goldenrod, daisies, and camas. While butterflies are kind of attracted to flowers that will provide them a wide landing pad. Flowers in the colors of orange, red, yellow, or purple, like a zinnia, like Oregon grape, coreopsis, and asters. And I've pictured this lovely landing strip coneflower right here, a perfect example of a wide floral landing strip for a butterfly. But flowers are only part of the picture. Butterflies and moths require plants for their immature caterpillars to feed on, not always a flowering plant. These plants, often native to our region and in the Pacific Northwest, can include ground cover, such as kinnikinick, and yarrow, which is a low-growing plant that flowers, and native white oak and willow, also excellent host plants for many caterpillar species. Well, as you probably perceived, in short, there's such an array of the pollinator's needs that the best strategy you can use is to provide a diversity of flowering plants with differing shaped flowers that provide nectar and pollen to the insects. Also, pollinators need access to flowers throughout the course of their lifespan. Now, in the case of social bees, honeybees, across the lifespan of their colony. Some insect pollinators, like the butterfly, finds it pretty easy to move across the landscape. So when the patch of flowers that they were seeking is no longer blooming, they can just fly somewhere to a new patch of flowers. But that searching does take up a lot of energy. And for the nest building pollinators, like bees, foraging is really restricted to a short distance from their nest. And if the bloom stops during the period when the bees are building nests, the result is reduced reproduction. They need their source of nectar and pollen close by. Now, I know as gardeners, I'm talking to expert gardeners out there, early spring, as you know, is a crucial time for flowering plants to be available for the emerging mason bees. I'm sure you probably have one or two near your garden. Well, if those mason bees emerge and there are not enough blooms sufficient blooms for them, it will affect their mating, and few of them will survive to create a new generation. And of course, you'll also want to provide flowering plants for fall. On the left here, you'll see some beautiful helenium, or on the right, this agastache or hyssop. They're both late blooming perennials. In fact, these perennials bloom from midsummer well into October and early November if the weather stays fair. And I find that they're just loaded with bees almost all the time. Not only will it make them happy, it will make you happy because you'll have abundant blooms to enjoy in your garden. And because they are blooming still in such late fall, it will support migrating butterflies and other late season pollinators that are starting to prepare for winter. Shrubs provide massive blooms. A larger plant will always produce more blooms. The shrubs shown here offer just the right ones for those emerging bees and other insects during early spring. I was just out looking around at a natural area, and I found the Indian plum and the red flowering currant both in bloom right now, and the Oregon grape just beginning to bud out. Also, I noticed an abundance of resources on big leaf maples. I know it's a big tree, but it has a big impact as well. And here are some perennials that bloom into the late fall. All Oregon natives, these bloom profusely. In fact, I didn't think they were ever going to quit blooming in my yard. This article that I've attached here will give you more information on bloom times for different shrubs, trees, and perennials, so that as you think about your pollinator garden, you think, what do I want blooming in the spring? What do I need for midsummer? What about fall? You will want to include all those so you have continuous blooms well throughout the season. Here's an example of a very wise gardener. This is Barbie Bird's parking strip garden that she's planted with a diversity of flowering shrubs, grass, perennials, and annuals. When you look at this list, you can see that she just about hit all the notes. She's got switchgrass, blue flax, spirea, coreopsis, Russian sage, lavender, rudbeckia, yarrow, drumstick allium, California poppies, fescue, and sea holly. And as you can see on the far left, for the spring, things are just emerging. She's got lots of blooms there for those early emerging insects. In the summer, that California poppy really wanted to take over. But by fall, you can see she's still got abundant blooms for migrating butterflies, for insects that are beginning to overwinter. So she has ensured continuous blooms for pollinators throughout the growing season. So include native plants. Why include native plants? Well, native pollinators forage on native plants, and we do want to encourage those native pollinators. And although non-native plants like magnolias, hydrangeas, dogwood, roses offer profuse blooms, it's kind of found that they're not widely visited by a broad array of native pollinators. Again, research conducted by the Garden Ecology Lab at OSU suggests that exotic plants or hybridized plants that are highly attractive to bees may not attract the diversity of bees that native plants, such as Bluefield Gilia or Douglas aster, will attract. So mixing native plants with other horticulture plants can help maintain flexibility around landscape design while still maximizing a benefit to the pollinators. Here I've pictured Globegelia, which I think is really beautiful, particularly if you can get it to grow in this much abundance, and of course Douglas aster. And it's just the gift that keeps giving in your garden. It blooms and blooms and blooms, and both are lovely addition to any garden style. Plant your perennials in groups. Why? When planting, consider arranging your plants so that they're in swaths or large grouping. It not only is more impactful for color, but it assists pollinator insects, particularly those little bees, as they forage in the garden. They spend a whole lot less energy moving from plant to plant. The larger the patch, better. Now, I have in my personal garden, I have a limited space, but I do try to achieve the same effect by planting in groups of no less than 5 to 7 plants, and I try to stagger them amongst other plants so it makes a swath of blooms. The Xerxes Society, experts on bees, recommends planting the same plant in 3-foot blocks. My goodness, I do love showy flowering plants in my landscape. However, I am aware that when some varieties are hybridized to produce those glorious blossoms that I'm so in love with, both the nectar and the pollen are affected. The extra petals interfere with nectar production and really make it difficult for bees to access those floral organs that produce nectar and pollen as they're located at the base of the flower. As the flower is very complex, wending their way through there is difficult. Instead, open pollinated native sunflower varieties or cultivars like sunflower lemon queen, pictured here at the far left, or Coreopsis zagreb in the center, or Helenium autumnal betty offer copious amounts of pollen for pollinators, and it's easy to reach. It's a single flower. I've again included another handout that discusses bloom time and attractiveness to certain pollinators that you may find helpful when you're trying to pick plants for your pollinator garden. Include bulbs and trees, both essential. And, beautiful and early season bloomers, bulbs can provide such beauty early on, which I'm enjoying in my garden now, and you probably are too. They provide a flush of early season nectar and pollen. And I really love this idea of planting crocus in grass turf, just digging a hole, sticking the bulb in, covering up, and then enjoying this beautiful array of blooms in the springtime. It's easy to do, but unfortunately in my household, my husband's in charge of the lawn, and I really don't want to start that discussion. So as much as I love pollinators, I choose to place groups of 5 to 7 bulbs throughout my garden beds to accomplish the same objective. Now, regarding trees, your landscape may not be able to fit a large tree in the landscape. They take up a lot of space, is true, but they're an excellent source of food for bees in early spring. I mentioned that big leaf maple at spring bloom, loaded with that abundance of pollen for bees, but it's a big tree, takes up a lot of space. Perhaps this vine maple, pictured on the far right, would be more amenable to your landscape because it's a smaller cultivar and more suited to a smaller garden space. Both of these are excellent ways to maximize pollinator resources. Now, before you think about selecting plants and planting them, think about how you're going to take care of these plants. Before you do any planting, make sure that you know all the plant's needs. Many perennials prefer at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. Some are tolerant of shade, but for the most part, the plants that pollinators love sunlight. You want your plants to be robust and produce as many blooms as possible. So you want to put the right plant in the right place to ensure the best rooting system and the most abundance of blooms, and of course the longest bloom period. And that will happen if all the plant's needs are met. Removing spent blossoms of species like the yarrow, the lavender, the Monarda, Coreopsis, and asters before they set their seed will extend your bloom time. You'll have more to provide those pollinators with. Now, it is important to leave some areas in your garden bare for ground nesting bees. This photo on the left, where the little white circles show you where the bees have nested in the ground, are important. They need this open soil in order to make their little nest. On the right, you'll see there's woody debris and hollow twigs there that also provides nesting material for above ground nesting bees. These hollow stalks are still upright. They'll probably fall over during the wind and rain of winter, but it's important to leave some of this debris around our gardens, particularly as we get into fall and to winter, so that these bees have a place to nest. I can't say this strongly enough. Reduce or eliminate insecticide use. Pesticides, whether an insecticide or herbicide, have a negative impact on pollinators. And really, most insect problems can be managed in the garden without the use of any chemicals. Please employ integrated pest management. Identify the pest, select the least toxic management strategy, and monitor for results. Then try something else, the least toxic if you need it. Least toxic methods should always be used first, and please strictly avoid any systemic chemical that will remain in the plant and can affect pollinators. A little side note, I placed this little tag here on the right-hand corner of this slide so that I could let you know that when you're purchasing plants for your garden, be aware that many nurseries use chemicals in the production of their plant stock so they look their best. I completely understand that. I want the best looking plant, but I also don't want to damage my pollinators by putting a plant in the ground that has been, that they've used herbicides and pesticides on. So look for a tag like this. It says, and I know it's difficult and small to read, but it says, "Be safe, neonicotinoid free." Neonicotinoids are particularly devastating to pollinators. Also, make sure that the plants you choose are adapted to the climate and soil type in your area and that they're winter hardy. Avoid selecting plants that tend to have pest or disease problems or are invasive and spread their seeds in unintended places. I'm thinking of butterfly bush or bachelor's buttons. I've included the Garden Smart handout here, which is very informative when trying to determine if what you've just purchased at the nursery might be an invasive species because it's taking off in your yard. And here's the reason why pollinators are so affected. They can be exposed to pesticides in so many multiple ways. Through direct contact with the pesticide or with pesticide residue that has remained on the foliage and flowers. They can be exposed in nectar and pollen if you've used a systemic pesticide that has drawn that pesticide up through the plant's vascular system. They can be killed through pesticide drift into areas where bees are foraging, nesting, or gathering their nesting materials. And, of course, pesticide runoff that contaminates the water that bees forage on or on the nesting beds of ground nesting bees. In short, any steps you take for least toxic solutions will help save our important pollinators. Now, we've discussed all those key aspects you should consider when thinking about establishing a pollinator garden, including plant diversity, importance of including native plants, providing continuous blooms, eliminating use of pesticides. Now let's move on to some practical aspects of creating a pollinator garden. Here are the essential considerations for this landscape plan you're going to embark on. Location, soil, planting bed preparation, planting plan, and maintenance. If you're selecting a brand new area in your yard to develop a pollinator garden, be sure and select one that receives 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. Plants, of course, that pollinating insects love prefer quite a bit of sun, full sun if possible. They also prefer well-drained soil and don't enjoy wet feet, so try to avoid areas that fail to drain properly. If you're inserting pollinating trees, shrubs, or plants into an existing flower bed, same rule applies. Try to locate the sunniest space and a well-drained area. Your new plants, no matter shrub or plant, will require supplemental water in the first 2 years of their development. So think about your site and a resource for water. If you live in an apartment or a condominium and are placing plants on a deck or patio, make sure your water source is convenient, since pots tend to dry out more quickly than plants that are placed in the ground. I just had to show you these pictures of these small planting spaces, because if your planting space is small, do not worry. Look at what they've achieved here. Just a narrow strip along the front or side of your home can become a haven for pollinators if you plant it with native plants and other blooming perennials. You're creating a wonderful habitat for them and a pathway for them to forage for nectar and pollen, hopefully in an adjacent garden where you've inspired someone to do a similar thing. I'm so pleased when I go on my daily walk and I find someone who has taken the area from their fence, which makes their backyard private, and the street, which was a bare strip filled with rocks or gravel. And they now have thrown out, first they throw out some wildflower seeds, and the wildflower seeds come up. And then I notice that they're so pleased by that, then they add some other perennial plants that they'd like to try, until pretty soon they have a beautiful garden where once there was just bare soil, mud, or rocks. So just remember, it all counts. Know your soil. So whether it's a space in your yard that you've already had plants in, or whether you're starting anew, you will want to know your soil. What type of soil have you got? Learn the pH of your soil, a test of the soil's acidity, and of course the porosity. We talked about perennial plants needing well-drained soil. I know some of you, I can feel it out there, you're DIYers, you want to do it yourself. There are garden supply stores that supply kits that will help you and analyze your soil, test the pH, search for those if you'd like to. If you would rather take your soil samples and send it to a lab that will give you some advice on amendments you could use for your garden, you can send it to the analytical lab servicing Oregon. There are many. Most perennial plants prefer a pH of 6.0 to 7.0. So now you've tested either yourself or you've sent your soil out to be tested. And now you know what you need to add to amend your soil to make it the best soil it can be for your pollinator garden. If you removed any lawn, or you removed any large plants that you felt like aren't adding to the bed that you're establishing, you want to just remove them to another place, you may need to replace that soil that's lost. Compost, yard trimming, follow the advice of your soil company. If they tell you to add certain things, do add those things. There are many companies that will deliver compost and soil products suitable for amending your soil. Make sure you ask them what is in the compost or topsoil. Find a reliable supplier and follow all the recommendation. And I just want to make a note here, amendments, things that you add to your soil to improve the physical or chemical properties of your soil to make it the best it can be for what you plan to grow there. A mulch is applied to the top of the soil to suppress weeds. And by the way, if you're using pots to hold your pollinator plants, use a good organic quality potting soil that's designed for containers. I said a little bit about sod removal or lawn removal, and there's just so many ways you can remove your sod. One way, use black plastic and lay it on top of the grass. It will essentially smother it, but that takes about 2 to 3 weeks, and it does use a plastic product, which I know some of you may not want to do. And even then, there are still roots and sod that needs to be removed. You can rent a hand or gas-powered sod cutter that's set at 1/4 to 1/2 inch that will separate the sod from the soil. Pictured here is that device. I don't think the men come with it. You have to provide your own men to do this, but then after it's all cut in sections, you can rake it up with a square shovel or pitchfork and compost the sod. I did this in my backyard. I didn't use a sod cutter. I just used my square shovel to take up the sod. that I could compost. But then I had deficit in the yard. I'd taken soil up along with the sod. So I didn't mix amendments into the soil. I put in compost and to improve the planting space and to restore the soil I had lost. And after I put my plants in, I topped the area with mulch to not only keep the weeds down, but to retain the moisture in the soil. I've included an article here by Dr. Alex Kowalewski, an OSU professor who will give you, if you read the article, give you more details about how to remove your sod. And of course, plan for irrigation. You will need to get adequate water to your newly established garden. And you know, it's so nice to have a drip system on a timer, but you know what? It's not necessary. Soaker hoses achieve the same thing. They provide water to the root zone directly, but there's also advantages in hand watering early in the day. It works great. And not only that, you're out in the garden, you're observing what's going on, you're monitoring for weeds, you're monitoring for any plant problems. So that works well also. Take your cup of coffee out there while you water. Remember, don't set your plants up for problems by watering them late in the evening. The water will not evaporate from the leaves, and it encourages fungus and other plant problems. So be wise, avoid a problem before it starts. Okay, now selecting plants. Now this is the really fun part. Use botanical names so you make sure you get the right plant. I've made that mistake. Also know your planting zone. The Willamette Valley is generally zone 8B according to the USDA planting zone map. But if you live somewhere outside the Willamette Valley, check your planting zone. When I planned my garden, I didn't need to consider trees because I already had two that met my criteria. But I did need to select shrubs and perennials that would provide blooms from spring until fall. You know, a garden is a very personal space. And I've had a lot of people say, you know, just hand me a plan and I'll just go get those plants and plug them in. But maybe that plan will not include plants that you like, what you enjoy. So think about picking what you like and what you enjoy. And of course, you'll want to purchase several of the same variety of plants so you can plant in blocks or swaths of 3 to 5 plants. When you visit the nursery, check the tags for height and width. The internet, by the way, is a pretty convenient source for determining how tall and how wide a plant gets when you're doing research and thinking about your garden design. It will also help you to determine if the plant will thrive well in a pot if you're thinking about potting up a plant for your garden. Double check the sun and shade requirements so you get the right plant in the right place. And remember that your garden won't look full immediately. It takes perennial plants up to 2 or more years to reach mature size. Patience. Trees and shrubs should be placed first, as they will be occupying the largest space. And you need to understand the space required for the tree or shrub to reach maturity and that where the roots are going to be requiring space. For that reason, please consider that trees should not be planted too close to structures or fences, or really even sidewalks where they may become a problem later when they become their mature size. A rule of thumb, small trees should be planted 8 feet from structures, large trees 20 feet from structures. It will help if you can just make a note of your height and width of your selection. It'll aid in placement. If your flower bed is one that can be viewed from only one direction when you're facing it, then of course, tall plants in the back, short plants in the front. If you have a flowering bed or a pollinator bed that you can walk all the way around, then tall plants in the center, short plants toward the front. This is a sketch that Laura Iyer did for us for another presentation, but it does illustrate that you can easily draw your own garden plan. Oops, sorry. Using graph paper. She uses 1-inch graph paper, 1 inch equaling 1 foot, so she can figure out how much space each plant is going to take using that guide. She grouped plants, as you can see. She gave them each numerals, and she has a key in which she lists all the plants by both their common and Latin name. And by the way, number 1 is a tree. So these 3 little plants are planted underneath the tree. And I love the groupings. I mean, it makes a more natural and effective presentation when plants are grouped, and you'll be helping out the pollinators. Now, I can feel some of you are skeptical. I just don't think I can draw this. Well, I've got more ideas for you. This plan is from Enhancing Urban and Suburban Landscape to Protect Pollinators by OSU. These are planting ideas for a native plant pollinator garden. All the plants in this plan are native plants. You can see that the plan or the bed is 60 feet by 25 feet. They've indicated that there is a dry end and a wet end. And the list of plants is following. Here are a list of shrubs that is on that planting plan. There are both common and Latin names included, so there's no mix-ups if you select any of these. Any number of these shrubs will enhance your garden habitat for native pollinators. There's some beauties in here. The tall Oregon grape, the red flowering currant, both early bloomers. California lilac, a stunning bloomer. And then, that's not all. These are the trees suggested for that native plant plan. Cascara tree is particularly appealing with its colorful leaves and its fruit in the fall. It's a smallish tree and might be more perfect for a small garden. And so is vine maple, which vine maple will also tolerate some shade. And then this list of wonderful perennials, sure to attract pollinators and produce blooms throughout the growing season. And of course, consider adding bulbs and seeds to your garden as time passes. Now, I will be honest with you, I planted my trees were existing, I planted my shrubs, I put in my perennials, and then I waited a little bit to see how everything settled in and how it looked. Did I like the way I designed it? I watched what did well, and I watched what failed to thrive, and then I made adjustments. And as time passed, I added camas and poppy and other native wildflowers over the course of time. This native plant plan has also ground cover, which is great for suppressing weeds, and adds more flowers for the pollinators very low to the ground. And lovely Farewell to Spring or Clarkia amowina and meadow foam, both lovely spring blooming flowers, and native to Oregon. But maybe you have ornamentals already in your garden, the garden bed that you're planning to use for pollinator plants, and you don't want to let go of them. You love them. What can you do? Well, here's some planting ideas for a native and non-native plant pollinator garden. So there are a mixture here. Again, the space is 60 feet by 25 feet, with one end very dry, the other end wet. And I want to point out the groupings of plants here. The asters grouped together, the tall Oregon grape grouped together, the evergreen huckleberry, the California lilac. It's very impactful when they're grouped like that and flower. My goal here is to give you some ideas of what plants may be attractive to pollinators and work in your space. This plan with some native plants and some horticulture plants features fewer trees and shrubs, but features a great many more perennials. And please notice that these perennials are a mixture of types with different flower shapes and in different colors. As you know, diversity is the key, as much diversity as possible. Oh, these are beautiful. And more, I told you this plan does include many more perennials, including grasses and other native plants. Lots of different textures, and that's important in garden design. Texture, as my friend Laura would say, is the shape and surface of the leaves of the plant. The texture of a grass is quite different from that of a stonecrop or a sedum, and the contrast creates a lot of garden interest. A texture description might include feathery, palmate, curly, lacy, jagged. And the texture of the surface of the leaves delights the eye of the beholder. Just another consideration when you're designing and thinking about your pollinator garden. Finally, annuals and bulbs. I love adding more crocus every year. Things happen to my crocus. I think I happen to the crocus, but and camas to my garden every year. Of course, you can plant your crocus in the fall and then just wait for the wonderful awakening to happen. And what's more beautiful than camas? Okay, the best time for your planting day. Well, the timing of your planting day is going to depend on when you're able to prepare your site. Depends on when you got started, what the considerations were when you needed to amend the soil and so forth. But here's some things to consider. Trees, shrubs, and perennials all do really well when planted in late fall to winter, like from mid-October through mid-November. I mean, think about it. The soil is still warm, and it gives them time to establish their roots because they're going to get necessary water in the form of rain throughout all the winter months. I've planted things in spring and fall, and just from my own anecdotal record, the plants I put in the ground in the fall and winter are they seem more robust and produce more blooms during the growing season. If I plant them in the spring, often we get that early burst of heat and they get a little bit stressed, and it impacts how they establish their roots. So if you do plant in the spring, just be mindful that they need to have enough moisture so they don't get stressed and fail to produce a really good root system. Bulbs, of course, planted in the fall or winter, and camas, I always plant the camas in about February at the latest, as they're emerging now in March, and they should bloom early to mid-April. Seeds will perform best if planted in the fall, but I have had success sowing them in the spring as well. It's just that planting seeds in the fall allows them to experience the cold snap that will stimulate germination when that warm weather does arrive. Steps to take on your successful planting day. Well, whether you opt for spring planting or late fall planting, setting up for planting day means doing the following. Get some 5-gallon buckets, fill them with water, plunge all your plants that you purchased in containers in their container into the water, and let them soak in the water until no more bubbles emerge from around the plant. That means you filled all the spaces around that plant's roots. So that's going to be needed for that plant to do well as it's put in new soil. After you've done that soaking bath, place your containers around the garden in the appropriate distance, as these ladies are doing in the photograph here. As you pop the plant out of the pot, examine the roots and gently feather them out a bit, encourage them to reach out for new soil in that new planting spot. In the end, it should probably look a little bit like a starfish. Make sure that your planting hole is at the right depth. Do not plant too deep. Do not plant too shallow. Make sure that the top of the plant, as it popped out of that container, is right equal at the top of the soil. Occasionally, you'll pop a plant out which has encircled roots. Please, make sure that you snip those roots and feather them out, just as I've described earlier. Same thing. It is okay for you when you're at the nursery to pop those plants out of their pot to make sure that they aren't encircled. Sometimes you'll find that they are, and you don't want that plant. The most critical time, of course, is going to be the first days of us after establishment. So provide them plenty of water early in the day so they have the water resources to take up into the plant. Monitor for weeds regularly, and any sign of plant stress, of course. These weeds are very clever. They love to get a head start when they think it's too cold and you won't be out there looking. But get out there and check for those weeds that might threaten your new plantings. And if you've planted in late fall, midwinter, you might want to leave that plant tag where your plant is located, because when it loses its vegetation, it's a little bit hard to mark its placement. Well, now you've got all those plants in the soil, so consider some other touches that make a difference. Provide some water sources for the insects and the birds. If you can provide a form of moving water, like a bubbler fountain or a larger water feature, boy, you'll be rewarded with lovely sound for you and happy wildlife. Of course, a bench is a wonderful welcoming invitation to sit and enjoy the garden. I included, here's some instructions for a butterfly puddler here at the bottom of the page. And maintaining, of course, you'll want to keep that garden looking great so people passing by admire it. So monitor it regularly for weeds, any other problems that your plants might exhibit. Checking for signs of stress early means that you'll have a chance, perhaps, to move that plant, maybe not happy there. Remove spent blossoms on species like Astrum monarda, extend that bloom time. And while you're out there, think about how you might expand your garden, or, as I said, adjust or move any plants that are not getting enough sunlight. If you're disappointed because you think your pollinator garden doesn't look full enough, it looks a little sparse, well, add some annuals like Cosmos or Zinnia to fill in those bare spaces until your perennials have a couple of years to mature. As fall approaches, enjoy those blooms as long as possible and allow the plants to die back naturally. There's no need for you to cut back stalks or pick up fallen leaves until spring when you notice new growth emerging at the base of the plant. Remember, those hollow stems, leaves, and other debris offer overwintering for beneficial insects. The picture in the center here that looks just like a dry twig, why, there is a leafcutter bee nesting in that hollow stem. So, when February comes and you have those sunny days, you think hot dog, spring's here, and you want to go tearing out there and start cutting things down. Well, I always go time out. You need to wait until we've had about 10 days of weather above 50 degrees before you start cutting back any stems. And that will allow any hibernating insects to emerge and move on their way. I've also been known to tie those stems into bundles if I think there might still be insects in there that need to emerge, and lay them at the edge of the garden until I think all chance of them emerging has happened. I'm always tweaking and adjusting plants. Plants mature and they cause changes in the environment, like providing shade where once there was full sun. Remember, a garden of any type is a changing ecosystem. Now I want to spend a couple minutes discussing options for people that have decks or patio spaces and not so much yard space. Using a variety of containers for your pollinator plants is the solution to your space problem. Select containers that are pleasing to you, and there are so many choices, from lightweight plastic, there's fiber, fabric pots, ceramic. I always go for the ceramic ones. But if you're like me, as time passes, the weight of that pot becomes a consideration for me. And you might be lucky and be able to put a lightweight plastic pot inside of a large ceramic pot so that it can be easily removed. But no matter what style you choose or how you solve that problem, make sure there's adequate drainage from that pot, that the size of the drainage hole is big enough, and that you give the plants enough room in the pot to grow. I've pictured up here in the upper right-hand corner some pot feet or pot toes. The lower one is called pot toes. They are great. They lift the pot up off of your deck or patio and allow water to escape the pot. They're not expensive, and they will also be kinder to your deck and patio. Then your pots won't make stains on your deck or patio. And of course, there's several options for deck or patio rails or window boxes that will help you maximize space. You can have stunning window boxes that hang on the railing that look great. As for what combinations work best for a container pollinator garden, well, it's pretty endless in the way of selections. A lot of it depends on whether or not you get like only morning sun, or you get sun all day blasting away, or you get shade for the morning and then sun in the afternoon. So you need to consider that. But you can create stunning containers by mixing different types of native or hybrid horticulture plants. Employ the thriller, filler, spiller formula. Thriller being the taller plant in the center of the pot, filler occupying the middle, and spiller tumbling over the edge. I've listed some examples up here. Pacific natives for thrillers could be fringe cup, goat's beard, huckleberry. Huckleberry is delightful for birds. Penstemon. A filler could include asters, wild ginger, yarrow, fleabane, allium, and a spiller could be verbena, kinnikinick, or nemesia. There are lots of plant ideas out there, and I imagine you will discover some selections that work well in your space and create a lovely pollinator habitat. These two pollinator gardeners have employed containers to either add height and focal point to their garden. On the right, you see this red pot, not only adds height and adds another place for a plant to be, but also a nice focal point for that garden. And on the left, this is the side of a driveway, and it's possible that the soil there is just not amenable to a garden. So she's used pots to plant all of her pollinator plants. Looks lovely. Well, I've given you a lot to consider, but if you employ some of the steps I've mentioned, these pollinators will soon be visiting your patio, deck, or garden space. I've included, for those of you that want to use pots and whatnot for a deck patio, a pollinator garden, a link to UC Davis article on pot selection, potting soil, and plant suggestions for your deck or patio garden. Well, to summarize, a pollinator garden is successful if you use a diversity of plants that will bloom throughout the season. Include trees, shrubs, seeds, and bulbs, as well as native plants in your planting plan. Prepare your site adequately and plan for ways to irrigate your new acquisitions. Select plants that are appropriate to the sun and shade that you can provide on your site. Water and monitor your new plantings frequently. The first few weeks and months are going to be critical. And if necessary, and a plant starts to look kind of stinky, relocate it to a more favorable spot in your garden. And finally, enjoy all of your hard work. Here is a list of all the resources I used in preparing this presentation, and I'd like to thank the OSU staff for all their wonderful information. A few more. And now we have time for some questions, I think.
Hey, Cheryl. That was amazing. We got so much information, and we, of course, have a few questions that people would like to ask you. One of the things that came up repeatedly was people with challenging situations, like I've got a shade garden, or, I've got a space that's just really, really dry, or, some of the what we consider not ideal pollinator garden areas. And can you give us like some shade plant examples or where we can go to find that information?
I gave you lots of resources on plant lists, and there are some shade plant things on that list. And certainly wild ginger is very forgiving. It will grow in a shade spot. Like it's a woodland plant. Oxalis is a great woodland plant. There are lots of shade. I do understand shade. When you kind of want to get hire a tree man that will take those large trees out that are shading your garden when you really want to grow abundant blooms on things. But you can achieve a nice pollinator space using shade plants by just thinking about woodland plants that thrive in the understory. Evergreen huckleberry is a wonderful bird-friendly plant, wonderful pollinator plant, and it is so carefree and it's lovely. Has a white blossom, so there are shade plants that you can. So keep trying, keep trying. I know it's frustrating when you don't have enough sun, and you really want to grow Monarda and you can't.
I actually grew Monarda in a pretty shady space, and it did well, but the mildew on it just was, as you can see, the picture behind me is the Monarda that I took from the shade area and transplanted into a sunny area, and it is
tenacious and it will
happier.
Try. Yeah, it is tenacious and it will try to persevere, because I did a similar thing. And you're right, the powdery mildew, because it lacks circulation in a really shaded area, it kind of takes over.
Yeah. Okay. Talking about different specific plants, one of the questions was, you mentioned Coreopsis, and is any Coreopsis, or are there certain varieties that are preferred? What have you got on that?
Coreopsis is a wonderful plant of all types, but I do notice that Coreopsis zagreb, it's Zagreb, and Coreopsis moonbeam are very popular with the pollinators and the pollinator garden.
Okay, I'm writing those down right now. Um, I think another thing to take a look at is as plants are hybridized, they're often hybridized to have like more petals.
Yes.
And so I was looking it up after we got that question, and there's a couple that are available that have a lot more petals, so it makes the pollen harder to get to.
Very,
So
very much a
again,
problem.
talking about that flat surface where the pollen and nectar is easy to get to.
Right.
Um, do you have some ideas on, or do you know if nurseries are required to label something that has been treated with neonics or neonicotinoids, or is that just a voluntary thing?
I am not aware that there's a law that says they have to state whether or not they use it. If you ask them, if you go to the nurseryman and you ask him and you tell them that you're concerned that you do not want any plants that have neonics in them, they will answer you truthfully because they're in business to please the customer. And obviously,
Mhm.
but I do know the suppliers that they get their plants from are doing a much better job of tagging those plants that state neonicotinoid free because they know
Mhm.
how damaging it is to pollinators. But I'm not aware of a law, don't we? We can't law our way out of it. We just have to count on people's honesty. If it doesn't have a tag that indicates one way or the other, I would always ask the merchant about it.
Yeah, I know that I'm working with a gentleman who works with Environment Oregon, and that's a environmental group that is really pushing to have neonicotinoids banned in Oregon, but we're
Good
not
for
there
him.
yet.
Yeah, good for
Yeah,
them.
so
Yeah.
it's a good organization.
And you know,
I was Go ahead.
just an aside, you know, at the Marius Young Park where I am in charge of that pollinator garden there, somebody asked me if I used fertilizer, if I used sprays, if I used, I haven't had to use slug bait or any kind of anything or fertilizer on those plants at all. We add compost occasionally, maybe every 2 years we add, yard compost to the top of the beds because we get a lot of rainfall, but there really aren't any pest problems. So if there's no pest problems, there's no need for those dangerous
Yeah.
chemicals for you and I as well as the insects.
Yeah, I would
That's
I would encourage anybody if you're in the Portland area, check out the pollinator garden at Mary S. Young Park. Cheryl and Sherry have done an amazing job getting that going, and
it's fun.
Cheryl I know works a lot on keeping
It's
it looking gorgeous.
Yeah,
But
it's a fun place to be and it's fun to talk to gardeners. And I did see one person ask a question about, do you recommend leaving seed heads on the plants as winter sets on? Absolutely. Leave those seed heads. Not only does it allow for a winter interest in the garden, and Leah, you know this because you have a huge pollinator garden, is that it's a resource for the wildlife. So yeah, leave them on.
you just stole my next question that
Oh,
I was going to
sugar.
talk about. But here's the other thing I want to talk to you about. When you were talking a little bit about getting started with a garden and how you kind of planted some and then see how they did, and is it an ongoing process, or do you finally kind of get to the point where you're going, yeah, this is good and I don't need to mess with it much?
It is kind of an ongoing process because as plants mature, the ecosystem changes. And when I first started out, I just needed the time to look at the result and see if it pleased my eye and if it was meeting the needs of the pollinators. And I have been known to add more things, tuck them into different places, Pearly Everlasting, Farewell to Spring, tuck them in and see if they work successfully in the space that I can provide for them. So I guess it's always, yeah, I guess I'm always messing around with my garden. Short answer.
Because that's what we love to do.
That's what we
You
love to do.
mentioned Farewell to Spring, and that is something that I planted for the first time last year because I found from Garden Ecology Lab that the leafcutter bees really love that.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the questions we had was, is it okay if I put them in the fridge and plant them now? Are they going to do okay? or should I just hang on to these seeds and wait until fall? What's
That
your thoughts on that?
I might be tempted to start them in. Now, this is what I would do. I might be tempted to start them in a pot. You know, if I have a
Hmm.
little 4-inch pots, I might start them in a little pot and kind of nurture them along a little bit before I
Baby
put
them
them
a little bit.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, baby, because I just love them and I want them to do really well. And I'm very jealous of anybody that has a large patch of them because we're not there yet, but I'm working on it. So I might do that because mostly because for two reasons. One, I'm impatient and I want them to get them going. And two, I think maybe it'll give them a little bit of a head start. So by the time they get up enough, then you can put them in the garden and they should do fine.
I bought a flat of them last year. I was lucky enough to find them. And then because I'm disorganized, I didn't get them planted for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I thought, okay, it's June. Can I plant these out now? They're farewell to spring. They're not going to do anything, you know. Found out that farewell to spring blooms all summer long,
Yes,
you
it
know,
does.
into October.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know. And I'm excited to see if they have reseeded themselves this year. You know,
Mhm.
it's again, it's a big experiment.
I know it is. It's like having a large laboratory of
Yes,
fun
yes,
things to do.
but that's beautiful, beautiful
Yes, yes, it is.
laboratory as
Yes,
well.
it is.
Yeah.
And learning from other gardeners too. There's a young man who is a new gardener, but he's massively successful at growing farewell to spring, Clarkia Mowina, and
Mhm.
Pearly Everlasting, and we have long conversations about it. So
One of the pollinator plants here is meadow checker bloom. And as I was researching plants to put in my new garden, I found out that the Willamette Valley is the only place it grows in the entire world. And I thought that was really special
that
too.
is special.
And
Yeah.
it's a beautiful plant and the bees love it. So anyway, um, the last thing I wanted to talk about was I was just impressed with Barbie birds, the photo that
Oh,
you
I
had
know.
of that. And I was amazed at how each season it looked
It
so
looked great.
full.
I know. She did a
And I
great
just thought,
job.
how does she do that? You know?
Yes, she did. Well,
So
and you saw the impressive list of things that she planted there. So
yeah,
each one had its time to shine. And I think that can be an inspiration for us all. And it's a parking strip. So
yeah,
it might have just been grass or weeds or, nothing as attractive as she's produced. So I think
yeah.
that's great.
No, it's absolutely gorgeous. Gorgeous. Um, one last thing about leaving the seed heads, and we were talking about leaving the stalks and stems. Don't you find it really hard, especially like right now? It's like, okay, I just want to get going and I want to cut everything down.
Mhm.
And it's so frustrating. That I was reading in Xerxes that if you cut them down to like 12 to 18 inches tall and just leave that, really soon the new things grow up and cover that, but you're not disturbing the bees. But then you said also you've got like cut them and bundle them and put them aside. That's a great idea too, I think.
Yeah, lots
So
of them got in the pollinator garden, a lot of them got knocked down. We added compost and sometimes I have to work around solve work days, which might not be the ideal date. And so those that fell, I bundled up and just tucked along the side because there are
yeah,
undoubtedly insects still inside there that need to emerge. So that's a way to
yeah,
get around that. And there are some of us are some of us are neatniks and can't bear it, but the best thing to do is just let it be until it's
yeah,
really warm.
yeah.
Fall spring
Okay.
can be very tricky here in Oregon.
Yeah. And we get lovely days and then we get horrible days right after. It's like, so what are you going to do? Anyway,
Uh-huh.
okay, I think that's all of the questions that I've got here. I just want to thank everybody for coming
Yep.
and
Thanks, everybody. And
last
yeah,
comments.
next week, come back for growing vegetables and berries with Jane.
That's been great. And if you didn't get your questions answered, feel free to email us at the email that you will get with your Zoom link, and you
Mhm.
can send us questions, and Cheryl or somebody will answer them for you. So
Be happy to.
thanks again.
Happy gardening, everybody.